I'm Detective Deal. You're located at the 107 Precinct, second floor, Detective Squad area. Today's date is February 5th, 2017. Time is approximately 10:33 a.m. And I'm activating the tape this time. Now that I've advised you of your rights, are you willing to answer questions?
Okay.
Yes? Okay. All right. All right. Chanel, why don't we start with, I think it was a Tuesday evening on August 2nd, 2016. Do you remember that date and that evening?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And where were you at that time?
I was in at Gateway and Spring Creek Mall.
Okay, by Gateway and Spring Creek Mall?
Spring Creek Park.
Park?
Yeah.
All right. Were you inside the park?
Yeah.
Okay. And was anyone with you, or were you by yourself?
By myself.
All right. About what time did you get to the park?
About 5 o'clock.
And were you on a trail or you in the grass?
On the trail.
Okay. Now, while you were in the park, did something happen?
Yes.
What happened while you were in the park?
On the park, there was this girl jogging, and then one thing led to another because some other situation.
All right. Well, the girl that was jogging, was she by herself or with anybody else?
By herself.
And when you first saw her, where were you? Were you in the grass or were you on the trail?
On the trail.
All right. And were you moving or were you standing still?
Like I was moving, listening to music.
You were walking or jogging?
Walking.
Walking? And you were walking towards her?
I was walking towards, and then got side to side, and then one thing led to another.
You said as she got next to you, when she got next to you as she was running and you were walking, what happened then?
And then, because of a past situation, I got angry and then started hitting her and stuff like that.
Okay. Before you did, where did you hit her?
Like in the face and like in the mouth.
In the face and the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Before you hit her, did you grab her or did you just hit her right away?
Like kind of grabbed her first.
Grabbed her? And like, how did you grab her? What part of her body did you grab?
Like I started hitting her because of the incident that was going on earlier.
Right, but did you grab her before you started hitting her, or was the first thing you did was to hit her? What was the first thing you did?
I grabbed her.
Okay. And how did you grab her?
Like this.
Okay. With both hands?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what part of her body did you grab? Do you remember her shoulders, her waist, her neck? Do you remember?
Probably like around here.
Okay, around the shoulders. Did she say anything at all?
Mm.
No. Did she scream?
No, because her tooth broke.
I'm sorry? Her tooth broke? Right. Were you covering her mouth at all?
Mm.
No? Okay. How long would you say you were hitting her for? About how long in time? I mean,
The whole thing was like about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. How far off the path would you say you dragged her into the grass? Like how many feet about?
Probably about 10.
Okay. What was the status of her clothing? How was her clothing
Kind of
arranged?
like pulled off.
Pulled off?
Yeah,
Okay, what was pulled off?
like her clothes.
Now you said you did this because you had some anger. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can you tell me about that anger?
Because, I used to live in a different address than I currently live at now.
Right.
And then sometimes there's this man that comes around there. He play like loud music and carry a lot of friends around there. I didn't like it because I feel unsafe and comfortable. And I like my place private and peaceful. And usually I just...
No, I know, Chanel, I know that, like last night, you really didn't want to talk about this, right? Last night. But today, it was okay. You wanted to talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know that you told Detective Brown you wanted to straighten your life out, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then Detective Brown said to wait until you came in the room to talk about it. That's right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you did, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Is understanding that DNA is not all it, confession is not all it, and there are issues in the case that, as you all see, is much more complex.
Is this a win for you?
Well, it's not a conviction, so I guess that's a good thing, but closure would be a good thing too.
You know that my daughter was a force to be reckoned with.
And I guarantee you that you will be reckoning with that force, not only for the rest of your pathetic life, but for the rest of eternity as you burn in hell. My daughter was a big believer of karma. And as you could see, she's magical. The whole world knows she's magical. And I guarantee you, you will pay forever.
Justice will be served, okay? That's why we have the PD. That's why we have God. Justice will be served.
But what we need for someone to say, hello, I know the guy. That's what we're looking for. If I wake up and there's nothing for me to do, that's when the bottom's going to drop out. So I have to stay involved every day in every way. Today it's this. This is keeping me alive today.
And if you'll notice the dark wool hat, remember the day was August 2nd. A little unusual he's wearing a wool hat in the area there. We have to speak to this person. So that's the only reason we're putting it out.
A woman went out for a run in the early evening. Hours later, her father found her body in the weeds, and the detail that would eventually point police toward her killer was not a witness, not a camera, and not a confession. It was the fight she put up before she died. On August 2nd, 2016, 30-year-old Karina Vetrano left her home in Howard Beach, Queens, for a short run near Spring Creek Park. She had done it before, many times. Usually her father ran with her, but that evening he stayed home because of a back injury. Karina told him she would be fine. She was wrong. And what happened in that park would terrify an entire neighborhood, trigger one of the most intense homicide investigations in New York City, divide a courtroom, and keep generating legal controversy years after a jury finally returned a verdict. Stay with me, because this case is not only about a brutal crime. It is about a woman who fought for her life, a father who found his daughter with his own hands, a DNA trail that took 6 months to find a name, a confession that became the center of a legal war, and a conviction that, even now, remains surrounded by questions from those who believe the investigation went too far in its urgency to solve the case. But before we get into the crime, the search, and the courtroom, you need to know who Karina Vetrano was. Karina Ann Vetrano was born on July 12, 1986. She grew up in Howard Beach, Queens, with her parents, Phil and Kathy Vetrano, and her sister Tana. Phil was a retired New York City firefighter and one of the first responders at Ground Zero after the September 11th attacks. Kathy was a cancer survivor, and by every public account, the Vetrano family was exceptionally close. Karina was small in stature, just under 5 feet tall. But people who knew her described her as magnetic, energetic, funny, direct, a little firecracker. She loved fitness, writing, travel, and being around people. She had graduated from Archbishop Molloy High School and earned a graduate degree in speech pathology. At the time of her death, she was working as a speech pathologist with children, including children with autism. She was building a life. She had work she cared about. She had people she loved. She had plans. She also wrote. Karina kept a blog and left behind personal reflections on love, risk, identity, and the strange contradictions of being alive. Some of that writing inspired a short film called The Paradox. One line from that piece, often repeated after her death, described the dissonance of her existence, a woman drawn toward beauty, intensity, and emotional extremes. It is tempting, in true crime, to turn every detail from a victim's life into foreshadowing. But that would be unfair. Karina did not become important because of how she died. She mattered long before anyone knew her name from a headline. She was a daughter coming home from work, a woman who liked to run, a person trying to clear her head on a summer evening. And on Tuesday, August 2nd, 2016, that ordinary decision became the dividing line between before and after. That afternoon, Phil picked Karina up after work. They stopped for pizza. Back at home, Karina ate a little and then changed into running clothes. She was wearing workout gear and carrying her phone. Her father had injured his back and could not run with her. He told her he did not like the idea of her going alone into the trails near Spring Creek Park. Residents had complained about the area before. Parts of it were isolated. The vegetation grew tall and dense. Some locals referred to the brushland simply as the weeds. But Karina still wanted to go. She had just ended a relationship days earlier and wanted to clear her head. She was also training seriously and did not want to skip the run. So she reassured her father. She would be fine. Then she left. Surveillance footage later showed Karina jogging through the neighborhood toward the park shortly after 5 p.m. Those images would become the last known footage of her alive. At some point near the entrance to the trail, she turned toward the parkland rather than continuing along the more visible neighborhood route. It was still daylight. She had her headphones. She was exchanging messages with a friend. Then the messages stopped. At first, nothing about that would have seemed alarming. People pause while running. Phones go into pockets. Texts wait. But then 1 hour passed, then more. Karina did not come home. Phil felt something was wrong. He tried calling. No answer. Kathy called too. Still nothing. Soon, panic replaced worry. Phil contacted a neighbor and friend who worked in law enforcement, and police began searching. At first, they checked the routes Karina usually took. Then the search moved towards Spring Creek Park. Officers, dogs, and family members began moving through the dark, pushing past tall grass and thick brush. Phil stayed involved in the search. He kept calling Karina's phone. At one point, he saw the glow of it on the ground. The screen had lit up from one of his own calls. That sight pulled him deeper into the brush. A flattened patch of weeds. A body lying face down. His daughter. Karina Vetrano was found off the trail in the park, in a marshy, overgrown section of Spring Creek. Phil later described her position in devastating detail. Her body was rigid. Her legs were still arranged in a way that reminded him of running. He lifted her. He screamed. Officers rushed toward the sound. And when they reached him, he would not let her go. He kept saying the same thing. He needed to take his daughter home. The crime scene was brutal. Karina had been beaten. Her face was bruised. Her teeth were damaged. Her body was scratched. Her clothing had been pulled out of place in a way that led police to investigate sexual abuse. There was a visible hand impression on her neck. The medical examiner later ruled her death a homicide caused by strangulation. Investigators said it was obvious she had fought. Hard. She scratched. She grabbed grass as she was dragged. And at some point during the attack, she bit the man assaulting her with enough force to damage her own teeth. That fight became crucial, because police recovered DNA from the crime scene, including material under Karina's fingernails, on her neck, and on her cell phone. In a case with no eyewitness who could identify the attacker, that DNA became the single most important lead. But when investigators ran it through available databases, there was no match, no name, no immediate suspect. Just a genetic profile from a man who had apparently attacked a woman in a public park before sunset and vanished. The murder terrified Howard Beach. People knew that trail. They walked there. They ran there. Some had complained about security and the overgrown vegetation long before Karina's death. Now the fear was no longer abstract. A woman had been killed less than a mile from her home, in a place residents recognized. Police searched for days. They cut back vegetation carefully so they would not destroy potential evidence. They canvassed the neighborhood. They reviewed park activity. They checked registered sex offenders. They looked into people known to spend time in the area. They examined cell tower data. The FBI assisted with resources and mapping. And still, the case did not crack. The public was asked for tips. A reward was announced and grew with support from the community. Karina's parents spoke publicly in the days after her murder. Kathy Vetrano addressed the killer directly, telling him the whole world was against him and that he would pay. It was not a polished statement. It was grief speaking at full volume. Phil described Karina as full of life, someone who had lived more in 30 years than many people live in much longer lives. At her funeral, hundreds gathered. Firefighters formed an honor presence. Friends and family filled the church and spilled outside. The police asked Phil for a DNA sample during the services. He told them to take whatever they needed. If they needed his right arm, they could have it. That was the level of desperation in the search for answers. But behind the public grief, investigators were stuck. There were leads. Some went nowhere. A man associated with the nightlife world where Karina had worked part-time was examined and cleared. A person of interest sketch was released after a utility worker reported seeing a suspicious man in the area around the time of the crime. That lead also failed to produce an arrest. At one point, investigators even checked whether there might be a connection between Karina's killing and the death of Vanessa Marcotte in Massachusetts, another woman attacked while running. Authorities later concluded the cases were unrelated. The weeks became months. The DNA profile remained unmatched. Police collected hundreds of voluntary DNA samples, many from black men in the area, after forensic analysis led investigators to believe the unknown male donor was African American. That aspect of the investigation would later become part of the legal controversy surrounding the case. At the time, though, the NYPD was under immense pressure to find the person responsible. And in January 2017, one detective reopened a memory that changed everything. Lieutenant John Russo lived in Howard Beach and had been involved from the beginning. Months earlier, before Karina was killed, Russo had noticed a man behaving suspiciously in the area. It was a hot night, but the man wore long sleeves and a hood. Russo thought he seemed to be studying houses and yards as he moved. He called police. By the time officers arrived, the man was gone. The next day, another report came in about a suspicious man in the neighborhood. Later, Russo encountered him again and learned his name, Chanel Lewis. At the time, it did not turn into anything major. But months after Karina's murder, Russo remembered that encounter and asked colleagues to take another look. Investigators learned that Lewis, then 20, knew the broader Spring Creek area and had prior minor police encounters nearby. He agreed to speak with detectives. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample. And when the laboratory compared it to the crime scene profile, it matched. That was the break police had been waiting for. On February 4th, 2017, Chanel Lewis was arrested. The next day, during a recorded statement to police and prosecutors, Lewis gave a confession. He said he had been in the park. He said he saw Karina running. He described grabbing her, striking her, and placing his hands around her neck. He said he was angry because of a separate situation involving a noisy neighbor near his home. He said one thing led to another. He acknowledged that his hand had been injured during the encounter. The prosecution would later use that confession as one of the central pillars of the case. So would the DNA. So would searches recovered from Lewis's phone after his arrest, which authorities said included information about criminal charges, sentencing, and material connected to the Vetrano case. Police also highlighted that his DNA had been located on Karina's neck, on her phone, and in the mixture under her fingernails. The defense saw the same evidence very differently. They argued that Lewis had been questioned for hours without meaningful protection and that the confession was unreliable. They said it had been coerced. They said parts of it did not align cleanly with the physical evidence. They also challenged the handling and interpretation of the DNA, arguing that it was being treated as more conclusive than it truly was. And around the case, a larger debate began to grow. Was this an investigation solved by careful police work? Or was it an investigation so pressured by public fear and outrage that it became willing to stretch too far? That question would follow the case into court. Before the trial began, New York also saw a policy debate connected to Karina's murder. Her father became a vocal supporter of familial DNA searching, a method that can look for close biological relatives of an unknown DNA contributor when there is no direct match in the database. New York authorized familial DNA searching in 2017 for certain serious crimes, though the rule took effect after Lewis had already been arrested. Supporters saw it as a way to solve violent cases that might otherwise go cold. Civil liberties groups warned that it could pull innocent relatives into investigations based only on family ties. That debate would continue long after the Vetrano case. But for the Vetrano family, the immediate focus was still the man police had arrested. Chanel Lewis was indicted on multiple counts related to murder and sexual abuse. He pleaded not guilty. His first trial began in November 2018. The courtroom was packed. Karina's mother held a cross. Lewis's mother held a Bible. Both families were present. Both believed something life-changing was on the line. The prosecution argued the attack was random. According to that theory, Lewis crossed paths with Karina in the park, carried anger from elsewhere, and unleashed it on her. The state focused heavily on the DNA and the confession. A forensic biologist testified that the genetic evidence strongly linked Lewis to the material recovered from Karina and her cell phone. The medical examiner described the injuries that showed a violent assault and strangulation. Phil Vetrano testified about the search and about finding his daughter's body. The defense responded that there was no eyewitness identification and no surveillance video placing Lewis at the exact murder scene at the exact time. They said the DNA could not answer every question by itself. They said the confession was the product of exhaustion, pressure, and vulnerability. They also attacked the integrity of the investigation, arguing police had locked onto Lewis and then tried to fit the evidence around him. The jury deliberated. Then it sent word that it was deadlocked. 7 jurors reportedly favored conviction. 5 did not. The judge declared a mistrial. For Karina's parents, it was devastating. They had already sat through the worst details of their daughter's death once. Now they would have to do it again. The retrial began in March 2019. This time, the prosecution returned with the same core evidence and additional emphasis on Lewis's own statements, the phone searches, and the physical consistency of the case. The defense again said he was innocent. Again, they attacked the confession. Again, they argued the DNA had been overplayed. But after about 5 hours of deliberation, the second jury reached a verdict. Guilty on all remaining counts. First-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, first-degree sexual abuse. The Vetrano side of the courtroom erupted. Phil and Kathy wept. They thanked the jurors. They called it justice. But the case was still not done. Before sentencing, Lewis's attorneys moved to set aside the verdict, alleging juror misconduct. One juror said he had felt pressured and claimed other jurors had discussed matters improperly. The judge held a hearing and denied the motion. On April 23, 2019, Chanel Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additional consecutive prison time was imposed on the remaining convictions. At sentencing, Karina's family delivered statements that were agonizing. Phil said there had been no happy Christmases, no happy birthdays, no real joy after Karina was taken. Kathy brought Karina's shoes into court and described them as the shoes of a giant, a warrior, a queen. Phil said that, according to his faith, Karina would forgive Lewis if he asked. Then he added that he never would. When Lewis finally spoke, he said he was innocent and expressed sorrow for the family's loss, but insisted he did not kill Karina. That is where the legal record stood after sentencing. But the public debate did not end. Lewis's supporters argued that the NYPD had targeted him unfairly and that the case was shaped by racial bias, flawed forensic practices, and a rush to satisfy public pressure. His lawyers continued challenging the conviction. In 2023, they sought a new trial, arguing that police and prosecutors had not disclosed key details about how the investigation developed, including allegations related to race and DNA-driven suspect selection. And in February 2026, according to the most reliable reporting I found, a Queens judge rejected another effort to vacate the conviction, leaving Lewis's life without parole sentence in place for the time being, while the defense signaled it would continue seeking relief. I want to be careful here. I found several recent low-quality pages claiming there is a brand new 2026 retrial underway. I did not find reliable court or major news confirmation of that claim. What is supportable is this. the conviction has continued to face post-conviction challenges, and the most recent credible reporting I found says a February 2026 motion to vacate was denied. That distinction matters, because when a case is controversial, misinformation spreads quickly, and true crime storytelling should not add to it. The murder of Karina Vetrano remains a case with a legal conclusion and a social aftershock. For the justice system, a jury convicted Chanel Lewis and a judge sentenced him to die in prison. For the defense and his supporters, serious questions remain about the investigation and the fairness of the process. For Karina's family, neither debate restores what was taken. Their daughter went out for a run. She never came home. Phil Vetrano later created a small memorial near the place where her life ended. He said it was the only place where he felt a measure of peace, even though it was also the place where he found her. The family also helped build a scholarship legacy in Karina's name through Archbishop Molloy High School and related memorial efforts. Each year, those acts of remembrance try to do what the crime tried to erase. They put her name back into the world as a living presence, not merely as evidence in a homicide file. And that matters because beneath the trial, beneath the DNA, beneath the confession and the appeals, there is Karina, a daughter, a sister, a woman who worked with children, a writer, a runner, someone who was loved so fiercely that her mother stood before cameras and addressed a faceless killer with the full force of grief, rage, and devotion. A woman whose final act of resistance left behind the evidence that investigators would use to find the man the state says killed her. Karina's story became one of the most publicized murder cases in New York in the 2000s, not only because of how violent it was, but because of what it awakened in people. The fear many women carry when doing something as ordinary as going for a run. The dread of a loved one being late and the call going unanswered. The horror of a father walking into the dark and finding what no parent should ever have to see. And the uncomfortable truth that even when a verdict arrives, the argument over how justice was reached may continue for years. So here is the final question. When the evidence includes DNA, a confession, and a jury conviction, but the case also carries deep questions about police tactics, racialized suspicion, and post-conviction challenges. What does justice look like to you? Is it enough that the court reached a final verdict? Or do cases like this require us to keep examining how that verdict was built? Leave your thoughts below. And above all, remember Karina Vetrano not only for the way she died, but for the life she was living before that summer evening in Queens. Because that is where this story truly belongs. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.